Take a look at this chart. It shows the cost of food in the US steadily rising over the past 5 years.
The price increases have been mostly driven by supply related factors. It has been like a perfect storm.
Probably the number one reason has to do with climate change.
Adverse weather in major production areas, droughts in Argentina, Brazil, California, or excess rains in some parts of Europe and China. So Mother Nature is not working in favor of food production.
We've got a huge transportation problem.
Labor in general is becoming more expensive.
These rising prices can have serious consequences.
Food insecurity in particularly, it's truly a wicked problem, a problem that has much nuance to it and is multifaceted.
Disparities have always existed in terms of access to food. And so even before COVID, there were 35 million Americans who lived in households that were struggling to put food on the table. So it's not new.
In August 2021, the Biden administration increased assistance for the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, which was originally known as food stamps. The benefits will now increase by more than 25%, which means the average benefits will rise from $121 to $157 per recipient every month.
Whether it's food deserts, whether it's malnutrition, we have a serious problem in this country.
So why is food getting more expensive in the United States? What does that mean for Americans? And what can consumers do about it? That chart showed the average increase in food prices over time, but we can also break it down even further. In February 2017, 1 pound of 100% ground beef cost an average of $3.55. 3 years later, in February 2020, right before serious social distancing measures went into effect, it cost $4.03. It reached a peak of $5.33 in June 2020, but as the pandemic restrictions were lifted, grocery costs stabilized, at least temporarily. They began to creep back up slightly in January 2021, but the prices haven't been increasing nearly as fast as they were at the height of the pandemic.
My prediction is that prices of food are going to continue increasing through this year. In 2022, I think prices are not going to decline, but the rate of growth of food prices is going to go back to normal. We are not going to see the high level of price increases.
It's not just the absolute cost that shows food is getting more expensive. Businesses are getting creative about how to pass on higher costs to customers. There's a practice called shrinkflation. This is when manufacturers decrease the amount of product in a package while keeping the price the same. Two Harvard Business School researchers traced the trend back to the late 1980s when they found that Chock-full of Nuts reduced its 1 pound tin of coffee to 13 ounces in 1988. By 2004, it was down to 11.5 ounces.
What manufacturers don't want to do is scare off customers. So as prices go up, they have three choices. One is to absorb the cost and basically go out of business. That's not a very sustainable model. Number two is pass along those increased costs. Or number three, reduce the size of the amount of product that's in the package.
Downsizing the product while maintaining the same price is an effective strategy for businesses to save money. Consumers don't react the same way to sticker price increases as they do to downsizing a product because it's not as obvious.
Consumers do not do the math of how much I am paying per ounce or per pound. So reducing tiny bit the size of the packaging will not affect very much.
Climate change has an effect on everything, and it affects our agriculture, it affects our livestock. It can create natural events like floods and droughts over time. These are all things that if we don't get in front of, we may have a shortage of food supply.
The United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released a report in August 2021 that the UN Secretary General described as a, quote, code red for humanity. The report repeatedly says that climate change threatens global food security.
If you take a look at what's going on now with coffee, for example, in Brazil, Brazil just can't produce because of the rain as much coffee as we want to consume. So that means the price of coffee is going to go up about 30%. We've got the wildfires in California that are really destroying a lot of farms and a lot of ranches. We've got major problems as it relates to climate change and what's going on.
We talk about this tipping point as if it's something that's far off in the future, but the reality is that the actions we have today create an effect tomorrow.
The pandemic wreaked havoc on global supply chains across multiple sectors, from computer chips to lumber to shipping containers. The food production supply chain was no different. Food supply chains depend on many different factors. The process starts with the producers of food, like agricultural farmers growing crops such as soybeans, wheat, and corn. There are also dairy farmers and ranchers who raise livestock.
The cost of feeding them, the cost of keeping them hydrated, all of that factors in. And then the transportation. How do I get corn from Iowa delivered to New York City? That has to go from their silos to a truck delivered to someone to actually, sell that.
That means when the cost of food in one category rises, such as corn, the cost of livestock that are fed corn gets more expensive. If fuel prices rise, transportation costs rise, making food more expensive overall. There were transportation issues that were driving up the cost of food before the pandemic.
We've got an aging truck driver workforce, and they're retiring. They're not able to make as much money as they used to.
In the summer of 2019, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration created stricter rules for commercial truck drivers. The rule changes put a limit on the number of hours they could drive between breaks.
As a result of that, they're making less money. They don't get paid by the hour. They get paid by the trip. So if they can't drive 20 hours straight and they've got to take a break after 8 or 9 hours, guess what happens? They make less money.
The pandemic worsened these already existing issues.
What happened during the pandemic is, frankly, a lot of the imported and exported product, which comes by ship, which comes in containers, those containers were locked down wherever those ships were. And in some cases, they're still locked down. So we've got containers in all the wrong parts of the world that in some cases have food rotting inside.
In the beginning of August 2021, container shipping rates from China to the east coast of the United States hit new highs, with a 40-foot box costing more than $20,000. In early March 2020, that same service cost around $2,500. The pandemic triggered more than just transportation issues. Early in the pandemic, meatpacking and other food factories struggled to keep operations going as COVID continued to spread. At the end of April 2020, former President Donald Trump invoked the Defense Production Act in order to classify meatpacking plants as critical infrastructure and keep them open. This was meant to be a way to combat the stress coronavirus was placing on the food supply chain. The United Food and Commercial Workers International Union released a report in late June 2020 that said 238 UFCW frontline workers had died from COVID during the first wave of the pandemic. In July 2020, the CDC had found that 9% of workers at meat and poultry processing facilities across 14 states had been diagnosed with COVID-19.
The problem that these factories, whether it be a poultry factory or a frozen food factory, were built for efficiencies. They weren't built for social distancing. We need better, more efficient factories to be built. The idea of building one huge meat processing plant and being able to supply the country from it, that's antiquated.
Rising labor costs and the ongoing worker shortage also caused food prices to spike during the pandemic.
Labor is just becoming more expensive. So we have seen in the past few months that food retailers, grocery stores, restaurants, growers have to increase wages to attract workers.
It's a combination of all these factors. I think it's very difficult to say, what did the pandemic do? What does climate change do? What does transportation do? So, we've got to lump it all together and we've got to solve them all together.
When we think about the rising cost of food, one of the things that is clear to us is that families can't accommodate it. If you already have a really tight budget, if you're already struggling, that's going to make it worse. And for some people who are managing to hold it together and could basically consider themselves food secure, it pushes them into food insecurity.
The U.S. government has two different labels to describe when Americans don't have enough food: food insecurity and food insufficiency. Put simply, food insufficiency is a more severe form of food insecurity. The USDA considers a household food insecure if they were at times unable to access adequate food for at least one member of the household because they didn't have enough money or other resources. Food insecurity is measured in scales. A household can be considered food insecure based on their low food intake, but it can also take into account the quality of their diet. The U.S. government measures food insecurity levels with an annual survey. According to the USDA's latest household food insecurity report, around 13 13.8 million households in the United States were considered food insecure in 2020. The government measures food insufficiency more frequently than food insecurity with what's called the Census Household Pulse Survey. The U.S. government started collecting this data in April 2020. This means there's real-time data about the rates of food insufficiency throughout most of the pandemic. The survey asked respondents to characterize their access to food within the last 7 days. If they said that they sometimes or often didn't have enough to eat, they are classified as food insufficient. At the end of April 2020, 9.8% of all U.S. households qualified as food insufficient. That number peaked in December 2020 at 13.7%. As of August 2021, it's declined to 7.8%. But not all households are affected equally. While white and Asian households have followed the overall downward trend, Black, Latino, and multiracial households have not seen the same improvements.
This shows how much work really has to be done. It just makes me so angry that something like that could be happening in families purely because of racism.
Not much research has been done on the link between high food prices and increased food insecurity in the U.S. because the cost of food is low as a proportion of total household expenses relative to other countries. One of the most recent studies on the topic is from 2013. It found that local food prices significantly affect food insecurity for households at 200% or less of the federal poverty line. To put that in perspective, this would be a family of 4 living in one of the 48 contiguous states earning $47,100 a year or less.
Well, when our body isn't getting the nutrients it needs to run as efficiently as possible, it's going to degrade over time.
Food insecurity is very difficult, particularly for mothers, and we see that as a coping mechanism, they'll often make sure to feed their kids first, and so they'll be going without. It causes mental health problems for people because it's depressing if you can't feed yourself, and it's even more depressing if you can't feed your kids.
What we're hearing is that this is just one of a multitude of stressors faced by households in the past year, and it's really compounded that stress for them in a way that I think we're going to have to think very critically about how we intervene upon food insecurity in a way that's multifaceted and recognizes it as one of many social risks impacting health outcomes for families.
Policymakers and businesses do have options to help those affected by rising food costs. One approach the government has taken is to help lower-income Americans afford food as costs increase. There's general consensus among experts that federal food programs are the primary policy defense against food insecurity. SNAP is the largest federally run program. Formerly referred to as food stamps, the program provides money for food insecure families with the goal of increasing access to adequate amounts of healthy food.
These programs help families mitigate the rising costs so that they can afford to plan a dinner that has some fruits and vegetables, so that they can afford to have all the meals that they should have and give their children all the meals their children should have.
The 2018 Farm Bill directed the USDA to reevaluate what is called the Thrifty Food Plan by 2022. This plan is what is used to calculate the maximum SNAP benefits allowed.
The way that they calculated the benefits for SNAP really wasn't working. There wasn't enough money there for people to buy the food that they needed to buy in order to have a diet that was consistent with the dietary guideline.
This was the first time the plans had ever been reevaluated since they were created in the late 1970s.
And so from our perspective, since we work on the federal food program, we think it's very important that people continue to have access to SNAP and that it be adequate.
Rather than helping people gain access to food as prices increase, there are methods that could potentially lower the cost of food overall.
When it comes to climate change, we've got to change the way we do business. The first step is developing new technologies that can allow, whether it's for indoor farming, whether it's outdoor farming, to become more efficient.
New technologies can also help address rising labor costs, personnel shortages, and other supply chain issues.
Food supply chain needs to be better coordinated. Businesses along the supply chain need to share more data. We need better information to understand what are some of the forces that are driving demand and prices.
Incorporating things like AI and machine learning, they're really going to help forge more accurate predictive outcomes. When you're using things like AI, you're using it to couple with our human brain power to kind of quickly figure out what are the problems, what are the worst case scenarios, and how do we figure out ways to take those problems and turn them into solutions.
There are also some options for consumers when it comes to saving money at the store.
We've got to be better shoppers. We've got to look at the cost per unit. We've got to look at the store brands. Most store brands today are equal or better than a lot of the national brands that are out there, and they're less expensive.
Of attention gets put on fresh produce as being very nutritious and ideal, but in fact there are less costly alternatives that I always want to remind people of. There is no shame in relying on frozen food.
We can save money. There's no question about it, even as food prices are going up, but we've got to be smarter about it.